The mining drill hit something that shouldn't have been there. Deep beneath the red soil of Arcturus 7, where only rock and metal should exist, David Chen heard his equipment screech to a halt against what sounded like crystal. He wiped sweat from his forehead and checked the scanner readings twice. According to every geological survey, this area was supposed to be solid granite for another 100 meters down. David had been working the mines for 3 years now. Ever since the colony ship dropped him and 200 other families on this dusty frontier world. The work was hard, but it paid well, and someone had to dig up the rare earth metals that kept human civilization running across the galaxy. He wasn't supposed to investigate strange readings alone, but his supervisor was back at the main site, dealing with a cave-in, and David had always been curious by nature. He switched off the drill and grabbed his portable light. The hole was barely wide enough for a person, but David had crawled through tighter spaces before. The light beam cut through the darkness and revealed something impossible. Instead of rock, there was a chamber carved from what looked like black glass, with walls that seemed to shimmer and move when he wasn't looking directly at them. The chamber was small, maybe 10 feet across, but it felt ancient in a way that made David's skin crawl. Strange symbols covered the walls, glowing faintly with their own light. But what made him forget all about safety protocols was the sound coming from the far corner. A weak, high-pitched whimpering that reminded him of a kitten in distress. David squeezed through the opening and dropped into the chamber. His boots crunched on what looked like broken crystal, and he realized the whole structure was collapsing. Cracks ran along the ceiling, and small pieces of the strange material fell around him like deadly rain. But in the corner, partially buried under rubble, something moved. It was no bigger than a house cat, but definitely not any earth animal David had ever seen. The creature had 4 legs and a long tail, covered in scales that shifted between deep blue and silver. Small wings lay crumpled against its sides, and David could see they were torn and bleeding a fluid that looked like liquid starlight. The creature's eyes were closed and its breathing was shallow. David knew the rules about alien contact. Every colonist learned them during the journey from Earth. Don't touch unknown life forms. Report any discoveries immediately. Wait for the science team. But as he watched, the creature's breathing got weaker and more rubble fell from above. In a few minutes, this whole place would cave in completely. "Well, little guy," David said softly, "I guess we're both breaking the rules today." He carefully moved the larger pieces of rubble away from the creature. Its scales were warm to the touch, and where David's fingers made contact, they seemed to glow a little brighter. The creature opened its eyes for just a moment, revealing pupils that held tiny galaxies, before closing them again with what sounded almost like a sigh. David wrapped the creature in his work jacket and headed for the chamber entrance. The ceiling was coming down faster now, and he had to dodge several large chunks of the black crystal material. He made it through the opening just as the chamber collapsed completely behind him, sealing itself off as if it had never existed. Back at the mining camp, David faced a problem. The colony's medical facility was designed for humans, not alien life forms. Dr. Lisa Park was the only doctor for 300 people spread across 4 mining sites, and she was known for following regulations to the letter, but she was also the only person who might be able to help. David found her in the medical bay, updating patient files on her computer. She looked up when he entered, took one look at the bundle in his arms, and immediately started shaking her head. "David, please tell me that's not what I think it is," she said. "It's hurt pretty badly," David replied. "The whole place was coming down. I couldn't just leave it there." Dr. Park stood up and closed the door to the medical bay. She had dealt with David before when he'd brought injured workers in from the mines. He had a reputation for caring more about people than procedures, which made him a good friend but a difficult patient advocate. "You know I have to report this," she said, but she was already pulling on medical gloves. "Regulations state that any alien biological material has to be contained and studied by qualified xenobiologists. The nearest xenobiologist is 6 months away," David pointed out. "This thing will be dead by then, look at it." Dr. Park carefully unwrapped the creature and examined it under the medical bay's bright lights. The torn wings were the most obvious injury, but she could see other problems. Several scales were missing, revealing raw flesh beneath. The creature's breathing was irregular, and its body temperature seemed to be dropping. "I don't even know what its normal vital sign should be," she admitted. "For all we know, we could be making it worse." But as she spoke, the creature opened its eyes again and looked directly at her. There was an intelligence there that made her breath catch. The creature's mouth opened slightly, and it made a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Somehow, both David and Dr. Park understood that it was trying to say thank you. "Well," Dr. Park said, reaching for her medical scanner, "I guess we're both breaking regulations today." Over the next few hours, they worked together to treat the creature's injuries as best they could. The wings were the biggest challenge, but Dr. Park managed to clean the wounds and apply synthetic skin patches that seemed to bond with the creature's natural healing processes. They set up a small habitat in an unused storage room, with heat lamps and a soft bed made from medical blankets. The creature, which David had started calling Spark because of the way its scales glowed when touched, responded well to their care. By evening, it was able to stand on its own and even managed a few short hops across the room. More importantly, it seemed to understand that David and Dr. Park were trying to help. "It's learning," Dr. Park observed as Spark figured out how to work the water dispenser they'd installed. "Look how it watches everything we do, then tries to copy it." David sat on the floor next to Spark's bed, and the creature immediately climbed into his lap, purring like a contented cat. The sound was strange, almost musical, with harmonics that seemed to resonate in David's bones. He found it oddly comforting. "We can't keep this secret forever," Dr. Park said. "People are going to notice when I start ordering extra medical supplies, and you can't hide a growing alien in a storage room indefinitely." David stroked Spark's head gently, and the creature's scales brightened at his touch. "I know. But look at it. It's not dangerous. It's just lost and hurt." Neither of them realized that their simple act of kindness had already sent ripples across the galaxy, touching the consciousness of something vast and ancient that had been searching the stars for centuries. Somewhere in the deep void between worlds, the Dragon Empress Ashara felt her child's pain ease for the first time in ages and turned her attention toward a small, insignificant world called Arcturus 7. In the space between spaces where stars were born and galaxies died, something that had slept for 1,000 years suddenly opened eyes like burning suns. Empress Ashara had been meditating in the void, her massive form coiled around a dead neutron star, when she felt it. A tiny spark of familiar warmth, weak but unmistakably hers, calling across the infinite darkness. Her child lived. Ashara's true form was too vast for most minds to comprehend. She was older than the human species, older than their sun, a being of pure energy and ancient magic who had watched civilizations rise and fall like waves on a cosmic shore. Her kind had ruled the universe when it was young, before the smaller races learned to walk upright and dream of touching the stars. But, for all her power, she had not been able to find her lost offspring. The child had been born during a convergence of cosmic storms, infused with power that even Ashara didn't fully understand. 300 years ago, while traveling between dimensions, the child had vanished. Ashara had searched every world, every star system, every fold in space-time, finding nothing but cold silence. Until now. The sensation was faint but growing stronger. Her child was not just alive but healing. Someone or something was caring for it, easing its pain and fear. Ashara felt a complex mix of emotions she hadn't experienced in millennia. Relief that her offspring survived. Gratitude toward whoever was helping it. And underneath it all, a growing curiosity about what kind of being would show kindness to something they didn't understand. Ashara began the long journey toward the source of the signal. She moved through folded space, traveling distances that would take light years to cross in mere hours. As she flew, her presence created ripples in the fabric of reality itself. Aurora displays erupted in empty space where no solar wind should exist. Navigation computers on human ships began reporting impossible readings. Throughout the local, stellar group, sensitive instruments detected gravitational anomalies that made no scientific sense. On Arcturus 7th, David was discovering just how quickly Spark was learning. In the week since he'd found the creature, it had gone from barely able to stand to exploring every corner of its hidden room. More impressive was its apparent understanding of human language. When David spoke to it, Spark would tilt its head and listen with obvious intelligence. It had even started making sounds that seemed like attempts at human words. "It's trying to say hello," Dr. Park observed during one of her evening visits. They had settled into a routine where David would spend his off hours with Spark, while Dr. Park handled the medical monitoring. Spark looked up at the sound of her voice and made a complex series of musical notes that definitely sounded like, "Hello, Lisa," if you listened carefully. The creature's vocabulary was growing daily, along with its size. It was now about as big as a medium dog, though still light enough for David to carry. "We need to make a decision soon," Dr. Park said, checking Spark's healing wing with her scanner. "The wing is almost completely healed and it's been trying to fly. Soon it'll be too big to hide and too strong for us to contain even if we wanted to." David had been dreading this conversation. He'd grown attached to Spark in a way that surprised him. The creature seemed to enjoy his company, following him around the room and even attempting to help with simple tasks. More than that, David felt responsible for its well-being. He'd saved its life and now it trusted him completely. "Maybe we could find somewhere else for it to live," David suggested. "There are caves in the mountains where it could be free but still safe." Dr. Park shook her head. "David, we don't even know what this creature needs to survive long-term. What if it needs to be with its own kind? What if there are others looking for it?" That night, across the galaxy, several human colonies reported the same strange phenomenon. Military observers on deep space monitoring stations detected massive energy signatures moving through their sectors at impossible speeds. The energy readings were unlike anything in their databases, too large to be ships and too fast to be natural phenomena. Admiral Ross, commander of the nearest naval base, was awakened by his communications officer with reports of the anomalies. The readings made no sense. Whatever was out there was the size of a small moon but moving faster than their best warships. More troubling, it seemed to be heading in a specific direction rather than following any natural orbital pattern. "Could it be some kind of weapon?" Ross asked, studying the data in his ready room. "Unknown, sir," replied Commander Vale, his science officer. "The energy signature doesn't match anything we've seen from known hostile species. It's almost like it's partially existing in normal space and partially somewhere else entirely." Ross frowned at the reports. Humanity's expansion into space had brought them into contact with several alien species, most of them peaceful, but some decidedly not. The idea of a new threat approaching human space made his stomach tight with worry. "Track its course and alert all colonies in its path," he ordered. "If this thing is hostile, we need to be ready." Back on Arcturus the 7th, David was having the strangest dreams. He found himself flying through space, seeing stars and nebulas from impossible angles. In the dreams, he could feel a vast presence searching, calling out across the darkness. The presence felt ancient and powerful, but also sad and desperate. It was looking for something precious that had been lost. David would wake from these dreams with the oddest feeling that they weren't just dreams at all. Spark seemed to be having similar experiences, making soft sounds in its sleep that sounded almost like responses to some distant call. Dr. Park noticed the change in both of them during her morning visit. David looked tired despite a full night's sleep, and Spark seemed restless in a way it hadn't been before. "Something's happening," David told her. "I can feel it." Spark can feel it too. As if responding to its name, Spark looked up at them and made a sound they'd never heard before. It was musical like its other vocalizations, but deeper and more complex. The sound seemed to resonate in the room itself, making the walls vibrate. Slightly. That's new, Dr. Park said, running her scanner over Spark. Its energy readings are spiking. David, I think something is coming. She was right. High above Arcturus 7th, long-range sensors began detecting an approaching object. It was still days away, but it was massive and moving fast. The colony's automated. Defense systems couldn't classify it as any known type of ship or natural phenomenon. Governor Hayes called an emergency meeting of the Colony Council. The object was clearly heading directly for their world, which meant it was either very lost or very intentional. Either possibility was cause for concern. We need to consider evacuation procedures, Hayes said to the assembled colonists. If this thing is hostile, our defenses won't mean much against something that size. David sat in the back of the meeting hall, thinking about Spark hidden away in the medical facility. He had a growing suspicion that the approaching object and his rescued creature were connected somehow. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. After the meeting, he went straight to see Spark. The creature was standing at the small window of its room, looking up at the sky with an expression David had never seen before. It was alert and focused, as if listening to something only it could hear. You know what's coming, don't you? David said softly. Spark turned to look at him, and David could swear he saw understanding in those galaxy-filled eyes. The creature walked over and pressed its head against David's hand, making a sound that was almost like a purr but with notes of sadness mixed in. For the first time since finding Spark, David wondered if he'd made a mistake. Maybe the creature wasn't lost at all. Maybe someone had been looking for it all along, someone with the power to cross between stars to find it, and maybe that someone wouldn't be happy to discover that humans had interfered. But as Spark curled up in his lap, trusting and content, David knew he couldn't regret saving its life. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. He just hoped that kindness would be enough to bridge the gap between species when the time came. Reality itself seemed to bend when Empress Ashara arrived in the Arcturus system. Her dimensional ship materialized between the 4th and 5th planets, a crystalline structure the size of a city that existed partially in normal space and partially in realms beyond human understanding. The ship's arrival sent shockwaves through local spacetime, causing every instrument in the system to scream warnings about impossible energy readings. On Arcturus 7th, every electronic device shut down for exactly 17 seconds. When they came back online, the sky had changed. Where once there had been empty space between the stars, now there hung something that hurt to look at directly. It shifted and moved like a living thing, sometimes appearing solid, sometimes seeming to fade into the background of space itself. Governor Hayes stood in the colony's command center, watching his communications officer try to make sense of the readings flooding in from their orbital sensors. The numbers made no sense. The object was simultaneously measuring as 10 kilometers across and 10,000 kilometers across, depending on which instruments were doing the measuring. "Sir, we're getting a transmission," the communications officer reported, his face pale. "But it's not coming through normal channels. It's somehow speaking directly into our computer systems." Hayes felt his mouth go dry. "What's it saying?" "I don't think it's trying to communicate with us specifically, sir. It sounds more like it's searching for something. Or someone." The transmission wasn't words in any human language. Instead, it was pure emotion and intent, somehow translated by their computers into concepts they could barely understand. The presence was ancient beyond measure, and it was looking for its child. The message carried images of a small creature with scales that shifted colors, wings that caught starlight, and eyes that held miniature galaxies. Hayes felt his blood turn to ice. He'd heard rumors about something unusual in the medical bay, something that Dr. Park and one of the miners were keeping quiet. He'd chosen to ignore the rumors because Park was reliable, and the miner, David Chen, was one of their best workers. But now those rumors took on a terrifying new significance. "Get me Dr. Park and David Chen," Hayes ordered. Now, across the system, human military vessels were scrambling to respond to the massive intrusion. Admiral Ross had 3 destroyers in the area, but they looked like insects compared to the alien ship. Still, he had to try to protect the colony. "This is Admiral Ross of the Terran Defense Force," he transmitted on all frequencies. "You have entered human space without authorization. Please state your intentions." The response nearly broke his mind. It wasn't a voice speaking to him, but rather a consciousness vast as a solar system touching his thoughts directly. The alien presence was frustrated and growing angry. It had traveled across the galaxy following a trace of its offspring, and that trace led to this small world filled with tiny, insignificant creatures. The presence had no patience for the small ships. Buzzing around it like gnats, it wanted its child back, and these insects were in the way. Ross felt the alien anger like a physical weight pressing down on him. His ship's weapons were already charging, but some deep instinct told him that firing on this thing would be like trying to kill a hurricane with a handgun. "All ships hold fire," he ordered, though his voice shook with the effort of staying calm. "We need to find out what it wants before we do anything stupid." On Arcturus 7, David was in the medical bay with Spark when the world shook around them. The creature had been growing more agitated all day, pacing around its room and making sounds that seemed almost like calls for help. Now, with the arrival of the massive ship, Spark was practically vibrating with excitement and fear. "It's here for you, isn't it?" David said, kneeling down next to the creature. Spark looked at him with those impossible eyes and made a sound that was unmistakably yes in any language. But there was something else in its expression, a kind of confusion that David found troubling. Spark wanted to go to whatever had arrived, but it also seemed reluctant to leave. Dr. Park burst into the room, followed closely by Governor Hayes and 2 security officers. Hayes looked at Spark for a long moment, his face cycling through several emotions before settling on grim resignation. "Dr. Park, please tell me you have some idea what we're dealing with here," Hayes said. "The creature appears to be highly intelligent and has been learning human language at an incredible rate." Park replied carefully. "David found it injured in some kind of ancient structure. We've been treating its wounds and monitoring its health." Hayes turned to David. "Mr. Chen, I need you to understand the situation. That thing up there is looking for this creature, and it's big enough to crack our planet like an egg if it gets impatient. We need to give it what it wants." David felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You want to just hand Spark over? What if that thing hurt it in the first place? What if Spark was running away from it?" "Spark?" Hayes looked between David and the creature. "You named it?" "It needed a name," David said defensively. "And it's not an it. Spark is intelligent. Spark has feelings. You can't just give a person away because someone bigger shows up demanding them." As if to prove David's point, Spark moved to stand beside him, pressing against his legs in a gesture that clearly said they belonged together. The creature made a complex sound that both David and Dr. Park recognized as their version of no. Before Hayes could respond, the building shook again. This time, it wasn't from the ship's arrival, but from something landing just outside the colony. Through the window they could see a figure approaching that made their minds struggle to process what they were seeing. Empress Ashara had taken a form that wouldn't immediately incinerate everything around her, but she was still clearly not human. She stood 12 feet tall with features that were both beautiful and terrible. Her skin seemed to be made of the same crystalline material as her ship, and her eyes burned with the light of dying stars. When she moved, reality rippled around her like water. The colony's defenses, such as they were, opened fire automatically. Laser batteries and missile launchers targeted the approaching figure and unleashed everything they had. The weapons passed through Ashara without effect, as if she existed in a different dimension from the attacks. She didn't even seem to notice them. Ashara's attention was focused entirely on the building where she could sense her child. The small creatures scurrying around her were irrelevant, barely worth acknowledging. All that mattered was reclaiming what had been stolen from her. But as she approached the medical building, something unexpected happened. The door opened, and a small figure stepped out to meet her. It was one of the tiny creatures, holding her, child in his arms. David had made the decision without consulting anyone. He could feel Ashara's overwhelming presence pressing down on him like the weight of oceans, but he also sensed something else. Desperation. Fear. Love. This massive, terrifying being was a parent looking for their child. Spark was trembling in his arms, not from fear but from excitement. The creature was making soft sounds that David recognized as happy noises, though there was still that strange reluctance he'd noticed before. Ashara stopped 20 feet away, studying the human who dared to stand in her path. She could destroy this insect with a thought, but something made her pause. Through her connection with her child, she could sense emotions that confused her. The small creature in the human's arms was happy to see her, but it was also conflicted. It didn't want to leave the human behind. "I know you want your child back," David said, his voice carrying farther than it should have in the thin air. Somehow, Ashara's presence was amplifying his words, so she could understand them. "But Spark was hurt when I found it. We've been taking care of it, making sure it was safe and healthy." Ashara's first instinct was anger. These insects had taken her child, kept it from her for weeks. But as she reached out with her consciousness to examine her offspring, she found something unexpected. Her child was healthier than it had been in months. Its injuries were healing properly. Its energy levels were stable, and most surprisingly, it was happy. For the first time in centuries, Ashara experienced genuine confusion. She had expected to find her child imprisoned or mistreated. Instead, it appeared to have been cared for with remarkable skill and compassion. The human was still speaking, and Ashara found herself listening despite her initial dismissal of the creature's intelligence. "I know I'm probably breaking a dozen laws by keeping Spark," David continued, "but it was dying when I found it. We couldn't just let that happen. And now I think Spark has become part of our family. Maybe there's a way we can work this out without anyone getting hurt." Ashara looked at her child, really looked at it, and saw something that made her ancient heart ache. Her offspring was looking back and forth between her and the human, clearly torn between two loyalties. It wanted to be with both of them. This was not a situation Ashara had prepared for. In all her eons of existence, she had never encountered beings who would risk their own safety to care for something alien to them. These humans had nothing to gain from helping her child, and everything to lose from defying her. Yet here they stood, this small human holding her offspring with obvious love and protection, refusing to simply hand it over, despite the vast difference in their power levels. For the first time in her long existence, Empress Ashara found herself truly curious about these strange, short-lived creatures who seemed to care more about doing what was right than what was safe. The silence stretched between David and Empress Ashara like a bridge made of glass, fragile and terrifying. Around them, the colony had gone completely quiet. Every person who could see the confrontation held their breath, waiting to see if their world would survive the next few minutes. The massive alien being studied the human holding her child, and David could feel the weight of her ancient gaze like a physical pressure against his mind. Spark broke the silence with a series of musical notes that seemed to hang in the air between them. The sounds were more complex than anything David had heard from the creature before, like a conversation in a language made of pure emotion. Ashara responded with similar tones, though hers resonated with the power of stellar winds and the deep songs of space itself. David couldn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. He was watching a reunion between parent and child, and despite the vast differences in their forms, the love was unmistakable. Ashara's terrible features softened as she listened to her offspring, and something that might have been relief flickered in her burning eyes. But as the conversation continued, David noticed something strange happening. Spark kept looking back at him during the exchange, making sounds that seemed almost like explanations. The creature would gesture toward David, with one wing, then make a specific series of notes that caused Ashara's expression to shift from confusion to something approaching wonder. "What are you telling her?" David asked softly. Spark turned to him and made a sound that had become familiar over their weeks together, the musical equivalent of friend. But this time, there were additional harmonies woven into the word, layers, of meaning that spoke of protection, care, and something deeper that David couldn't quite identify. Ashara stepped closer, and David had to fight every instinct that screamed at him to run. She was beautiful in the way that cosmic phenomena were beautiful, too vast and powerful for human minds to fully grasp. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, carrying harmonics that made the ground beneath David's feet vibrate. "You cared for my child without knowing what it was," she said, and David was surprised to realize he could understand her perfectly. "You risked your safety to save a creature that could have been dangerous to you." "Anyone would have done the same thing," David replied, though his voice came out smaller than he intended. "No," Ashara said, and there was something like sadness in her tone. "Most would not. Even among my own kind, compassion has become rare. We have grown too powerful, too distant from the smaller concerns of life and death and simple kindness." She reached out one massive hand, and David's nerve almost broke as claws longer than his forearms approached. But Ashara moved with infinite care, barely touching his shoulder with one fingertip. The contact sent a shock of sensation through David's mind, and suddenly he was seeing himself through her eyes. He saw his own memories, but filtered through Ashara's ancient perspective. She watched him find Spark in the collapsing chamber, making the split-second decision to risk his life for a stranger. She observed his sleepless nights monitoring the creature's recovery, his patient efforts to communicate across species barriers, his genuine joy at each small sign of Spark's improvement. But more than the actions themselves, Ashara was experiencing the emotions behind them. She felt David's instinctive compassion, his inability to ignore suffering even when helping might cost him everything. She sensed his growing attachment to Spark, not as a possession or prize, but as a friend who had enriched his life simply by being in it. The revelation shook her more than she would have thought possible. In her eons of existence, Ashara had encountered countless species across the galaxy. She had seen civilizations rise and fall, watched entire races evolve from primitive creatures to spacefaring empires. But she had never experienced anything quite like human empathy. Her own people, the ancient dragons who had ruled the cosmos when it was young, had lost the ability to care about individual suffering somewhere in their long history. They saw the big picture, the grand movements of time and space, but had forgotten how to value a single life. It was a failing that had cost them dearly over the millennia. "You have taught my child something I had forgotten how to give," Ashara said, withdrawing her hand. "Not just healing for its body, but comfort for its spirit. It has been lonely for so long, wandering between dimensions where few creatures can survive. But you gave it companionship, made it feel valued and safe." David looked down at Spark, who was purring contentedly in his arms despite the cosmic drama unfolding around them. "It gave me those things too. I've never had a friend quite like Spark before." "Friend?" Ashara repeated the word as if tasting something new. "Yes, I can see that bond clearly now. My child chose well." Behind them, Dr. Park approached cautiously. She had been monitoring the situation from the medical building, but her scientific curiosity finally overcame her survival instincts. "Is Spark going to be all right?" she asked. "I mean, in the long term? We did our best with its injuries, but we're not xenobiologists." Ashara turned her attention to the doctor, and Park had to grip David's shoulder to keep from falling as the alien consciousness briefly touched her mind. "You healed damage that should have been permanent," Ashara said with obvious surprise. "How did you know which treatments would work?" "We didn't," Park admitted. "We just tried to help however we could, and hoped for the best. Spark seemed to respond well to standard trauma care, so we adapted our procedures as we went." "You succeeded where trained healers of my own kind might have failed," Ashara said. "Because you cared more about the outcome than the methodology." Governor Hayes chose that moment to join the conversation, though he stayed well back from the massive alien. Empress, we mean no disrespect, but we need to understand what happens next. Are you here to retrieve your child and leave, or is there something else you need from us? Ashara considered the question for a long moment, her star-bright eyes fixed on Spark. The creature had fallen asleep in David's arms, exhausted by the emotional reunion but clearly content. That depends, she said finally, on what my child wants. She knelt down until she was closer to David's eye level, though she still towered over him. There is something you need to understand about what you have been caring for. My offspring is not just another member of my species. It was born during a convergence of cosmic forces that occurs once every million years, infused with power that even I do not fully comprehend. Spark stirred in David's arms, opening one sleepy eye to look at its adoptive parent. The creature made a soft questioning sound, and Ashara responded with gentle musical tones that seemed to explain something important. There is a prophecy among my people, Ashara continued, speaking of a time when the universe itself will be threatened by entropy made manifest, a force of pure destruction that devours reality itself, leaving only void behind. The prophecy says that only beings capable of true sacrifice and unconditional love will be able to stand against this darkness. David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the alien's presence. And you think that time is coming? I know it is coming, Ashara replied grimly. The signs have been growing stronger for decades. Stars going dark not through natural death but through some kind of cosmic consumption. Entire sectors of space, becoming empty voids where matter simply ceases to exist. And at the center of it all, something vast and hungry, spreading outward like a cancer. She gestured toward Spark, who was now fully awake and listening to the conversation with obvious intelligence. My child was born to be part of the defense against this threat. But power alone will not be enough. The prophecy speaks of hearts that can love without condition, minds that can see hope in darkness, spirits that will sacrifice themselves for others without expectation of reward. David began to understand where this was leading. You think humans have those qualities? I have seen the evidence in your own actions, Ashara said simply. You saved my child not for reward or recognition, but because it needed saving. You cared for it not because you gained anything from doing so, but because it deserved care. These are the qualities the prophecy describes. Dr. Park stepped forward. What exactly are you asking of us? Ashara stood to her full height again, and, when she spoke, her words carried the weight of cosmic destiny. I am asking for an alliance. Not between ruler and subjects, but between equals who share a common purpose. My people have forgotten how to hope, how to care about individual lives in the face of universal threats. But your species remembers these things instinctively. She looked directly at David. And I am asking you, specifically, to consider becoming my child's permanent companion. Not as a servant or pet keeper, but as its guide in learning the qualities that my kind have lost. Spark trusts you, learns from you, finds comfort in your presence. These bonds may be crucial in the battles to come. David looked down at Spark, who was gazing up at him with those galaxy-filled eyes. The creature made a soft sound that clearly meant please, and David realized that this strange, wonderful friendship had become the most important thing in his life. If I agree, he said carefully, what would that mean? Would I have to leave my home, my life here? You would have access to knowledge and technology beyond human imagination, Ashara replied. You would see wonders that no human has ever witnessed. But yes, you would have to leave this world behind, at least for a time. David thought about his life on Arcturus 7th. The mining work was hard and lonely, the frontier existence challenging. But it was his life, familiar and safe. Still, as he looked at Spark, he realized that safety had never been what mattered most to him anyway. Can I have some time to think about it? He asked. Of course, Ashara said. But know that time grows short. The darkness spreads faster each day, and we will need every ally we can gather. As if summoned by her words, alarms began sounding across the colony. Admiral Ross's voice crackled over the emergency communication system, tight with barely controlled panic. All stations, this is Admiral Ross. We're detecting massive energy signatures approaching from the outer system. Something's coming, and it's big. All colonies are advised to prepare for possible evacuation. Ashara's expression grew grim. It seems the choice may be made for us sooner than expected. The enemy has found us. The darkness that approached. Arcturus 7 wasn't empty space or the normal black between stars. It was something far worse. An absence so complete that it hurt to perceive. Where it touched the outer edges of the system, planets simply stopped existing, leaving behind voids that made the mind recoil from trying to understand them. David could feel it even from the planet's surface, a wrongness that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. Spark had gone completely rigid in his arms, making sounds of distress unlike anything he'd heard from the creature before. Around them, the air itself seemed to grow thick and difficult to breathe. "The Devourer," Ashara said, and for the first time since her arrival, David heard genuine fear in her voice. "It has tracked my presence here. I had hoped we would have more time." Above them, Admiral Ross's ships were trying to engage something that their sensors couldn't properly register. Weapons fire lit up the space around the approaching darkness, but the energy beams and missiles simply vanished when they reached it, not even creating explosions. It was as if they had never existed at all. "Admiral Ross to all stations," came the panicked transmission. "Our weapons have no effect. Repeat, conventional weapons are useless against this thing. All civilian vessels are ordered to evacuate immediately." But there was nowhere to evacuate to. The darkness was spreading in all directions, cutting off escape routes with methodical precision. Ships that tried to flee found their engines failing as they approached the boundary, their hulls beginning to fade at the edges where reality grew thin. "We have to do something," David said, looking between Ashara and the approaching void. "There must be a way to fight this thing." "There is," Ashara replied, but her tone was heavy with sorrow. "But it requires a sacrifice that I am not sure any being should be asked to make." She knelt down again, this time placing her massive hands on the ground around David and Spark. "The only weapon that can harm the Devourer is a directed burst of pure life energy, channeled through someone capable of truly selfless love. But creating such a burst would require the sacrifice of whoever channels it." Spark made a series of urgent sounds, and David didn't need translation to understand the creature was volunteering. "No," David said immediately. "Absolutely not. There has to be another way." "There is," Ashara said quietly. "The burst can be shared between multiple beings, reducing the cost to each, but it still requires at least one to serve as the primary channel, and that being must be prepared to give everything." David looked up at the approaching darkness, now close enough that he could see the edges of the colony beginning to waver and fade. People were screaming in the distance as buildings started to lose coherence, their matter being consumed by the advancing void. "What about me?" he asked. "Could I serve as the channel?" Ashara studied him with her ancient eyes. "You are not of a species naturally capable of manipulating cosmic energy, but with Spark as a conduit, and my power backing you both, yes, it might be possible. But David, you must understand, this is not a choice you can unmake. If we attempt this, there is a very good chance you will not survive." David thought about his life on Arcturus 7th, about the friends he'd made in the mining colony, about Dr. Park and Governor Hayes, and all the people who were now facing extinction because an ancient evil had followed Ashara to their world. He thought about Admiral Ross and his crews dying in space while trying to protect civilians with weapons that couldn't even scratch their enemy. Most of all, he thought about Spark, still trembling in his arms but trying to be brave. This wonderful, intelligent creature that had brought so much joy into his life in such a short time. "If I don't do this, everyone dies anyway," David said. At least this way, they have a chance. David, no, Dr. Park said, having approached during the conversation. You don't have to do this. We can evacuate, find somewhere else to go. Where? David asked gently. You saw what happened to the ships that tried to leave. That thing is going to keep spreading until it devours everything. Someone has to make a stand. Ashara watched this exchange with growing amazement. Even facing certain death, these humans were more concerned about each other than about their own survival. It was a quality her own ancient people had lost somewhere in their long history, and seeing it now made her understand why the prophecies had spoken of a younger race with hearts unmarked by time. There may be another way, she said slowly. If multiple species work together, sharing the burden equally, we might all survive the channeling, but it would require perfect trust between beings who barely know each other. David didn't hesitate. I trust you, and I trust Spark. If there's a way to save everyone and still stop that thing, let's do it. Spark made an emphatic sound of agreement, looking up at both David and Ashara with determined eyes. Dr. Park stepped forward. If you're going to try this, you'll need medical support. I don't understand the energy involved, but I can monitor your vital signs and try to keep you stable during the process. I can provide additional power, Ashara said. My species has more experience with cosmic forces than most. But the emotional component, the pure love that drives the weapon, that must come from you and my child. Governor Hayes had joined them, along with several other colonists who refused to hide, while others faced danger on their behalf. What can we do to help? He asked. Believe in us, David said simply. Sometimes that's all anyone can do. The darkness had reached the edge of the colony now, and buildings on the perimeter were beginning to dissolve. They could hear the void itself, a sound like reality screaming as it was torn apart. There was no more time for preparation or doubt. Ashara began to glow with inner light, her crystalline form becoming a beacon against the advancing darkness. David, you must link your mind to mine through Spark. The creature will serve as a bridge between our consciousness, allowing us to share the burden of channeling. David held Spark close as the creature's scales began to shimmer with the same light that surrounded Ashara. He felt a connection forming between the three of them, a bond deeper than friendship or family. Through Spark, he could sense Ashara's vast consciousness, ancient and complex but driven by the same protective love that motivated his own actions. Now, Ashara said, think of everyone you want to save, not as abstract concepts, but as individuals with hopes and dreams and people who love them. David thought of Dr. Park and her dedication to helping others. Governor Hayes trying to keep the colony together against impossible odds. Admiral Ross and his crews risking their lives in space. The families huddled in their homes, parents holding their children and hoping for a tomorrow that might never come. The energy built between them like a star being born. It was warm and bright, and filled with every act of kindness David had ever witnessed or performed. He felt Spark's simple, pure affection adding to the mix, along with Ashara's ancient but rediscovered capacity for caring about individual lives. Together, Ashara said, and David could hear both her voice and her thoughts through their shared connection. Let them see that love is stronger than entropy. The beam that erupted from their joined forms was visible across the entire system. It struck the advancing darkness like a lance of pure creation, and where it touched, the void recoiled. For a moment that lasted an eternity, two fundamental forces of the universe stood opposed. The hunger that would consume everything, and the love that would preserve it. The devourer let out a sound that was felt rather than heard, a shriek of frustrated rage as its advance was not just stopped but reversed. The darkness began to contract, pulling back from the worlds it had been consuming, reality reasserting itself in its wake. David felt the energy flowing through him like lightning, made of starlight. It should have torn him apart, but Spark and Ashara were sharing the burden, their combined strength allowing all three to survive what would have destroyed any one of them alone. When the light finally faded, The devourer was gone, fled back, to whatever deep void had spawned it. The system was safe, the colonies intact, the people alive and whole. David collapsed to his knees, exhausted but alive, still holding Spark, who was purring with contentment despite their shared ordeal. Ashara stood over them both, her ancient features soft with something that might have been wonder. "What we accomplished today should not have been possible," she said. "My people spent eons searching for a weapon against the darkness, never realizing that the most powerful force in the universe cannot be built or summoned. It can only be freely given." She knelt, down beside David and Spark, her massive form somehow non-threatening now despite its alien nature. "David Chen of Arcturus VII, you have shown me that strength without compassion is mere destruction, but compassion even from the smallest beings can preserve universes." The words were soft, almost a whisper, but they carried across the colony and beyond, transmitted somehow by Ashara's power to every human ship and station in the system. It was a recognition of something fundamental about humanity that even they themselves sometimes forgot. "Thank you," she continued, "for teaching an ancient being that there are still new things to learn about the nature of love." Dr. Park ran over to check on David, scanner in hand, muttering about impossible energy readings and miraculous survival rates. Governor Hayes was coordinating with Admiral Ross to make sure the evacuation order was canceled and that everyone knew they were safe. But David was focused on Spark, who was looking up at him with obvious pride and affection. "So," he said to the creature, "I guess this means we're partners now?" Spark made a sound that was unmistakably yes in any language, then added a series of more complex notes that David was beginning to recognize as his name in the musical language of dragons. Ashara stood up, but instead of preparing to leave, she began to shift her form. The massive crystalline figure gradually became smaller, more humanoid, though still clearly not human. When the transformation was complete, she stood about 7 feet tall with features that were beautiful but definitely alien. "If you will have me," she said, "I would like to establish a permanent embassy here. My people have much to learn from yours, and the universe has many more threats that will require our combined strength to face." David looked around at the colony that had become his home, at the people who had become his family, at the vast cosmos beyond that was full of wonders he was only beginning to understand. In his arms, Spark made happy sounds and nestled closer, content in the knowledge that they would all face whatever came next together. "I think," David said, smiling up at the stars, "that sounds like the beginning of a beautiful alliance." Above them, Admiral Ross was already coordinating with Earth Command to send xenobiologists and diplomats to formalize humanity's first alliance with a cosmic power. Dr. Park was documenting every detail of what had happened for the scientific journals that would revolutionize human understanding of the universe. But in the quiet moment before the chaos of first contact protocols and interstellar diplomacy took over, David simply held his friend close and marveled at how one small act of compassion in a collapsing cave had somehow changed the fate of the galaxy. Sometimes, he thought, the most important thing you could do was simply refuse to let someone suffer alone. Everything else would work itself out from there.